So here's the background of Napoleon. You should have read this in your book, but at the age of 9, Napoleon is sent to military school. And I mentioned that he earned some credibility with the revolutionaries when he was chosen to help defend them at the National Assembly. And so he's really set up for success in this new government. And so when they appoint him as the leader of the military, uh, he is sent out to go fight in Austria, and he wins a series of victories over there in Austria. And reports are sent back, and they talk about the great heroic victories, and it boosts morale, and people are all excited about what's happening there. And so then um, in 1799, he goes into the national legislature, and he begins a slow but swift takeover of that legislative assembly. And this is part of what is known as the coup d'etat. And this is a takeover of power that's usually not supported by the will of the people, nor is it part of the way that the government has been created. It's just somebody who decides that they're going to run in, take over the government without the consent of anybody else. And so when he does so, he dissolves the directory, the leaders of the assembly, and tells them that they're not needed any longer. And then they establish a set of three consuls. And one of those three consuls was Napoleon. And Napoleon quickly took upon himself the title of first consul. Kind of sounds a little bit like Julius Caesar, but we won't go down that path right now. But he took the title of first consul, and he assumed the powers of a dictator at this point. And so he quickly took over power in France, and this is part of the coup. And it's the coup d'état is a French term known as a blow to the state, or a quick takeover of the government. It's not planned, and it's not the desire will of the people. So by the time we get to 1802, just a few years later, Europe is at peace for the very first time in a number of years. And Napoleon is now able to focus his energy on restoring France and getting order in place. And he worked out a peace agreement with all of his enemies, and nobody was at war or frustrated or upset with France at this point. And it's the first time in a long time. There's another link to a video here on what is a coup, what is a coup versus a revolution or rebellion, and it's interesting insight into some of the more modern coups that have taken place. And so I'd encourage you to watch that uh, on your own. Now, in Napoleon's government, he establishes a plebiscite, which is a vote of the people. And this was held to approve the new constitution that he had been writing and putting together. And when the people vote in favor of this new constitution, it's what gives Napoleon some real power. Because now all of a sudden he has the support of the people, where he did not have that previously, or he wasn't sure if he had that. And so now that he knows he has the support of the people, his first task is to go to help the economy and put it onto some solid ground. So Napoleon set up a very efficient method of tax collection. If you remember back, one of the first things that started this whole revolution was unfair taxation that was happening. And so he began to put together a better method of taxation, and he established a national bank. And along with that, he knew that he had to stop the corruption in the government. So that way he could firmly establish his system of government without people accusing him and his leaders of corruption. So he dismisses a number of corrupt officials, and he trains his new officials the way that he believes that they need to be running. He also sets up lycees. Now, lycees are government run public schools, and these schools are intended to teach people the way of Napoleon's government. And so the goal was that when they graduated, they would now be offered a government position rather than giving the government positions to the friends of the leaders. And so now they were going to be giving it to those who had earned it and who had worked for it. Now, if you remember back, we also talked about the church in France and how it had been essentially pushed out under the reign of terror. Well, we have a push from the peasantry as well as members of the clergy that want to bring back the church into France. And so Napoleon responds to them, and he signs a document known as the Concordat, or the agreement. And he signs this document with the Pope, and it established a new relationship here between the church and the state in France. So the government here recognized the influence of the church, but it did not allow or rejected the church's control in national affairs. And so the Concordat really gave Napoleon the support of the church, as well as the people really liked this whole idea of bringing back the idea of the church. And it was a positive move for Napoleon, and it seemed to be a pretty good move for the church to open the doors once again in France. So Napoleon thought really his best work was in his system of laws, known as the Napoleonic Code. This was a uniform set of laws that eliminated a lot of the injustices between the class systems, and it limited liberty in order to promote order and authority over individual rights. So the Napoleonic Code was very government driven, but it helped to create a system of security among the people, as well as to have an authority structure for them. And a lot of governments in Europe followed many of the Napoleonic laws later on. In 1804, Napoleon decided he was going to make himself emperor. And the French people seemed to support this idea. And so many people were watching this whole ceremony take place. And here Napoleon takes the crown from the hands of the Pope and he places it on his own head. And as he did this, Napoleon sealed, or he signaled and decided that he was going to be more powerful than the church. And traditionally, the Pope was the one who crowned the emperor, but Napoleon decided he was going to do that himself. He didn't want anybody else telling him what to do. Now, he had this view of how he was going to conquer the world, first of all, going after Europe, and then he had his sights set on North America. He already owned Louisiana, he owned parts of Florida, he owned parts of the West Indies, and so he knew that he was going to need access to those areas. Unfortunately for him, many of the ideas of the revolution had spread over into the West Indies, which caused a revolution to break out there. And he had to focus a lot of his attention to hang on to the sugar plantations that were there to settle peace. And he began to see how he needed to get money back home in France to help implement many of his new policies. And so he decided to offer the Louisiana Territory to the United States. In 1803, the United States was still relatively young. They had won their independence from Great Britain, and President Thomas Jefferson here was in a position where he could afford to purchase the land, but he couldn't afford a high price. So Napoleon said, "I'll give you the land for $15 million." Napoleon had two benefits that he saw in this sale. First of all, he was going to get money to help finance operations in Europe. The second reason may have been a little more important when he decided that he was going to use this as a punishment on the British. Because as Napoleon stated that, or Napoleon thought in his mind here, that if he sells this land to the United States, it strengthens them. And your book has this quote here. It says that the sale assures forever the power of the United States. And I have given England a rival who sooner or later will humble her pride. And eventually, the United States is going to go to war again with Great Britain, and this is in the War of 1812. And this additional land and power that the United States has gives them the ability to defeat France, or defeat England in that particular war. Now, in Europe, Napoleon's going to set his sights on a few other territories. He's going to get influence in Italy, the Netherlands, as well as Switzerland. And this is going to send off red flags to many other countries around France. And so these other countries begin to put together a coalition of forces to stop Napoleon's advancement, to make sure that he doesn't get too much power. And so the British persuaded countries like Russia and Austria and Sweden to join them together to go and fight against France. Many of the opposing commanders could not predict what Napoleon was going to do, and it frustrated them. And many times, Napoleon, with smaller armies, was able to outmaneuver some of these bigger bigger armies presented by the Russians or the British. In the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon issued a proclamation expressing his pride in his troops. And this was in 1805 after the Battle of Austerlitz. He says, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you. On the day of Austerlitz, you justified everything I was expecting of you. In less than 4 hours, an army of 100,000 men, commanded by the emperors of Russia and Austria, was cut up and dispersed. 120 pieces of artillery, 20 generals, and more than 30,000 men taken prisoner. Such are the results of this day which will forever be famous. And it will be enough for you to say, 'I was at Austerlitz,' to hear the reply, 'There is a brave man.'" So Napoleon here is telling all these men, go home, brag about this, put it on your Facebook page, on Twitter, put it on Instagram, and everybody's going to think, "Man, that's awesome that you were there at Austerlitz. You are a hero." And that's exactly what he wanted the people to think. So the Battle of Austerlitz was a pivotal moment here for Napoleon's power, a pivotal moment here for his advancement of France. Now, unfortunately, there was in that same year the Battle of Trafalgar. And just as he saw success at the Battle of Austerlitz, he saw the same type of defeat in Trafalgar. So even though he sent home word about this great battle and people heard about it, the other one, the Battle of Trafalgar, was probably a worse defeat than the victory at Austerlitz. So it's almost as if it drug him down so much more because this battle was not a battle on land. And Napoleon was very skilled on land, but his battle tactics on water were not as good. Now, Napoleon wasn't the commander in charge here, but he did appoint somebody to lead here at this battle. And it showed at the end here of this battle there were two major results. First of all, it ensured the supremacy of the British Navy, really for the next 100 years, and the fact that the French Navy was no match for the British. And second of all, Napoleon knew that there was no way he was going to be able to invade Britain because Britain's navy was stronger and they were going to surround Britain with their navy, and there was no way France was going to be able to break through. Here's a map showing the locations of both of these. We see the Battle of Austerlitz was in Austria, and the Battle of Trafalgar was just south of Spain. And one being a huge victory, the other being a pretty significant blow to his empire here. Now, Napoleon here wanted to make sure that his empire was carried on, and so unfortunately his wife was not able to bear children, and so he needed to find an heir to his throne. So he divorced his wife, and he arranged a new marriage here, ironically with a member of the Austrian royal family, even though he had just been at war with them. And she was the grandniece of Marie Antoinette, so a slight relation there. And she gave birth here to a son, Napoleon II. And Napoleon II here was named the King of Rome. Now, he's not going to be extremely significant, at least at this point, but I do want you to know that he is the heir to Napoleon's throne. Now, there were three big mistakes that Napoleon makes that led to his downfall. First of all, he established the continental system. The continental system was his policy to help make continental Europe very self-sufficient. And he also wanted it to stop Great Britain's commercial and industrial economy. And so he set up a blockade around Great Britain to make sure that all trade had to go through France before it could go to any other European nation. And so France would collect the taxes on it, and it would also cause problems for Great Britain in the trade that they wanted to make. It delayed all their shipments, and it also meant that shipments to and from Britain were taxed by the French. And so Napoleon's blockade, unfortunately, was not nearly tight enough for him, and many of the allies here that were supposed to be working with Napoleon, they disregarded the blockade, and they didn't follow through on what Napoleon had asked them to do. And so Britain, of course, is not going to sit by and let this happen without response, and so they're going to have their own blockade, and the British blockade was going to be much better because they had a better navy. And so they were able to better blockade the British, and the British were able to blockade, or I have that backwards. They better blockade the French than the French were able to blockade the British. And so this is part of what leads to the War of 1812 because it involves the Americans when the British begin to stop all of the neutral ships that were going back and forth between North America and Europe. And some of those ships were American ships, and America got tired of it and they got sick of it. And so they were eventually brought into war because of all that was going on there. Oh, let me go back here. In 1808, Britain makes another big time mistake. He wanted to try to get Portugal on board with the continental system, and so he sent an invasion force to go through Spain to get to Portugal. Well, Napoleon here had removed the Spanish king and put his own brother on the throne of Spain. And this made the Spanish very upset and brought out more of their nationalistic feelings. And so, for about 6 years here, a number of Spanish peasants, known as guerrillas, continued to fight the French armies in Spain. And these guerrillas were non traditional fighting forces. They would hide in the mountains, they would sneak up and surprise attack. It was not traditional warfare that Napoleon and his troops would have been used to. And so this carried on for a number of years. And uh, this idea of nationalism began to spread around more and more countries of Europe, where countries began to have more allegiance and alliance to their home country. And their loyalty to their country was the most powerful weapon here against Napoleon. Now, maybe his most disastrous mistake here comes in 1812. Even though Alexander of Russia had become Napoleon's ally, the Russian Tsar here refused to stop selling grain to the British. It was a good, profitable market for them. And Napoleon continued to try to negotiate here with Russia to try to stop them from helping out the British. And so in June of 1812, Napoleon and he called them the Grand Army. He had 420,000 soldiers. They marched into Russia. And as Napoleon continued to advance, Alexander pulled his troops back. And so Napoleon would advance and Russia would pull their troops back. And at first, Napoleon just kept moving forward and forward until he realized what the Russians were doing. The Russians were practicing an idea of scorched earth. And in this battle tactic, as they would retreat, they would burn everything and leave nothing behind for any of the French troops to be able to collect and live off of. And the deeper and further they went into Russia, the more scarce any resources became. And it meant that the soldiers of the French army were beginning to starve to death. They were running low on supplies, and there was nowhere to get it. And so, as the Russians pulled back, they were burning their grain fields, they were slaughtering livestock, leaving nothing for the enemy to eat. And you can see here on this map here, the two armies finally clashed here in September of 1812, the Battle of Borodino. And after several hours here of very indecisive fighting, the Russians fell back again, and now the door was open for Napoleon to move on to Moscow. When he gets into Moscow, the city had been burned and it was in flames. And instead of surrendering to the French, the Russians here had destroyed the city. Napoleon stayed there for a few days or a couple of months, I guess it was, until he decided to go back to France. There was really nothing for him to gain there in Moscow. So as he made his way back toward France, the snow began to fall. The Russian soldiers continued to attack Napoleon as his soldiers were ragged, as they were starving, as they were cold. And many of the soldiers here were killed in these battles on their way home, retreating back from the attack on Moscow. Many of them died of their wounds or died from exposure to the elements. And so finally, here in the middle of December, there were very few survivors that were still with Napoleon as they staggered out of Russia. And the retreat here out of Moscow was actually worse than any of the battles that they had fought along the way. Only 10,000 of the 420,000 soldiers were left to fight, and Napoleon's Grand Army was no more. And so Most of these troops were not trained well enough and were not ready for battle. And so the Allied armies come in and they easily defeat Napoleon. And the inexperienced and defeated army of Napoleon here crumbled very quickly. And the Allies were able to go in to attack Paris. So in April of 1814, Napoleon accepts the terms of surrender and he gives up his throne. The victors who win now gave Napoleon the option to be exiled and cast out of his country. And so they banished him to an island of Elba. And this is a tiny island just off the Italian coastline. Well, he escaped from Elba in 1850 and he gets to France. And there are a lot of people there welcoming him, and they're excited to see this great leader Napoleon come back. And it's almost like a movie scene as he marches back into Paris. There are thousands of volunteers that come in and say, I'm going to fight for you, I'm going to be part of your army. And within just a few days, Napoleon here had regained his title as Emperor of France. Well, the British Army, led by the Duke of Wellington, they go to prepare for battle. And if you didn't write that down, write down the Duke of Wellington into your notes. And the Duke of Wellington for the British Army now goes to meet Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium. And in June of 1815, Napoleon is attacked there at Waterloo. The British Army is defeated, and late in the afternoon, the Prussian army comes in to help out. And together here, the British and the Prussians are able to bounce back, and they're able to come back to attack the French. So this defeat here of Napoleon was his last attempt to claim and hold his power. This was 100 days, and it's known as 100 days here, where Napoleon returned back from Elba, took over, had a new army, and then was defeated again at Waterloo. So during these 100 days, after he's captured this time, there's no chance at him returning. The Allied forces, the British, they shipped Napoleon off to a more remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic part of the ocean, and there he lived I shouldn't say all by himself, but very lonely and in exile there for 6 more years until he dies. Perhaps historians think maybe it was of some sort of cancer of the stomach. After Napoleon has now been banished, it is time for the Congress of Vienna. And as the European heads of government here were trying to establish a long-lasting peace, some sort of stability to the continent after Napoleon had been defeated, they tried to put together a new European order, one that would be secure and stable for everybody. And so they had a series of meetings here in Vienna known as the Congress of Vienna. And these were called to set up policies to try to get everybody together on the terms of peace. Originally, the Congress of Vienna was scheduled to last for only 4 weeks, but it went on for a full 8 months. The most influential member of this was Prince von Metternich, Clemens von Metternich. You can just know him as Prince Metternich. He is from Austria, and he's going to be the one heading this up. So he had 3 goals here at the Congress of Vienna. First, he wanted to prevent future French aggression by surrounding France with a lot of strong countries. Second, he wanted to restore a balance of power, so no country was going to be a threat to the others. And third, he wanted to restore the royal families to the thrones that they had before Napoleon's conquest. And so this strategy was one that Metternich, as well as the other powers, believed that was the best way to get France, as well as the other countries, reestablished in a proper balance of power. And your book says this: although the leaders of Europe wanted to weaken France, they did not want to leave it powerless. If they severely punished France, they might encourage the French to take revenge. If they broke up France, then another country might become so strong that it would threaten them all. Thus, the victorious powers did not exact a great price from the defeated nation. So as a result, France remained a major but diminished European power. Also, no country in Europe could easily overpower another. I think that's important here to evaluate, to think about what were the positives, what were the weaknesses of this strategy, and did it work? And we're going to have to explore some future history to answer that question. But I want you to understand what they did here at the Congress of Vienna and remember that as we look ahead towards some of the future things we talk about. So, the other leaders of Europe were very nervous about what had happened in the French Revolution. They worried that the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity are going to encourage revolutions to happen elsewhere, especially with Enlightenment ideas floating all over Europe. So in 1815, Alexander the First, he was in charge of Russia, as well as Emperor Francis of Austria and King Frederick William III of Prussia signed an agreement together called the Holy Alliance. And in this alliance, they pledged to keep their relationship together with other nations based on Christian principles so that they could stop any force of the revolution entering their countries. And so there were another set of alliances that were put together by Prince Metternich. This was called the Concert of Europe. And in the Concert of Europe, they ensured that nations would help one another if a revolution broke out in their country. The rest would come to their aid. And the key thing here to pick out of this is that this is the beginning of entangling alliances, where countries align themselves, they team up together for the benefit of the whole. And this is part of what's going to lead us down the road toward the First and Second World Wars. And it all goes back to this moment here. And so, in some ways, you might be able to draw a connection between World War I and the threat of Napoleon. And as World War I happens, it is loosely tied, but I think you can make the connection here to the fear that somebody could come back and do something similar to what Napoleon had done again.